Thank you for joining us on the Going Deeper podcast, a ministry of Fathom Church in Littleton, Colorado. You will never get to the bottom of the depths that are in Christ for you. And our hope with this podcast is that it will help you go deeper with God. So let's dive into this episode of the Going Deeper podcast. What's up, everyone? This is your host, Kyle Knight, and welcome to the Going Deeper podcast, a podcast where we have conversations, hopefully to help you go deeper in your relationship with God. I'm in the podcast studio with our very own missions and events minister, Karina Bost.
Hey.
Hi, Karina. And our lead pastor, Chris Martin.
Bonjour.
That's a new one.
Well, you know, I'm French today, so.
You're looking French. What?
I'm looking French? I'm not sure what that means, but it's making me uncomfortable.
You know what? I was going to say something. You're
you
looking a
look...
little French today.
I'm offended.
I'm sorry.
For myself and for all of my French friends. What does it mean to look a little French? Kyle, why don't we, we can change our whole topic for our podcast today.
Sure, yeah.
This is
Are we getting into, do we have some conflict now?
Well, I think so. I think so.
Look a little French.
Look a little French.
We'll leave it at that.
It was a compliment, okay?
I'm not, was it?
Yes.
Was it, Karina?
I don't know. You could
Didn't sound like one.
Stew on that for a little while to see if it was a compliment or not. But let's get into our topic. As you see by the title of this episode, we're going to talk about conflict. What do we do in conflict when we're in conflict with each other, especially as Christians? When there's something going on, like how do we deal with it? How do we deal with conflict? Good ways of dealing with conflict, not so good ways, unhealthy ways of dealing with conflict. So Chris, why is this an important thing? I mean, it is an important thing, but why talk about this now?
Okay, so my sense, as you know, I've been in pastoral ministry for like 20 years. My sense is that most issues that people have tend to be related to some sort of conflict. Like when I'm doing marital counseling, when I'm meeting with somebody who's upset with their boss or with their job or with their neighbor or with their spouse or even with somebody in their church or with their church, it tends to kind of root back to conflict with another person and either the inability or the unwillingness to enter into conflict, to pursue conflict resolution, to work through conflict. And conflict is absolutely an undeniable reality of any relationship. You will be in conflict with somebody if you're in relationship with them. It just depends on how deep that conflict goes and how much you let that conflict kind of simmer and fester. And my sense is, working with both adults and with young adults and youth, is that most people first hate conflict. Mm-hmm. Most people are conflict averse and would rather stick themselves in the eye with a red hot poker than deal with conflict. Mm-hmm. And I say that a bit tongue in cheek, but it's just, very few people actually enjoy conflict, but most people would do anything to avoid it. In fact, they would put aside their morals, their ethics, and even their maturity so they don't have to deal with that. So that's my sense when it comes to why this is important. Karina, Christians certainly don't struggle with this, right? This is only dealing with our unsaved friends, right? Is that what we're talking about when we talk about
clearly.
conflict? Yeah.
Yeah. No, absolutely not. And I'll be quick to admit I am one of those conflict averse. I don't like conflict. And so I've had to be very wise in my life and surround myself with people who will call me out when they see conflict and essentially push me to have conflict resolution, because my natural instinct is to run the opposite direction.
Yeah. Why do you think it is to run the opposite direction? Why do you think that's, and I don't think that's just you. Yeah. I think that's the most common response. Mm-hmm.
I think it's because it's uncomfortable. I think for me, a lot of times I feel like I am not expressing my thoughts or feelings very clearly. And so I don't want to be misunderstood what I'm saying. So like putting words to what you feel and what happened can be tricky. Just tension is not a fun place to sit.
Yeah. So sometimes people talk about like the human beings tend to have two distinct modes, the fight or flight kind of mode. And that's, I get that when it comes to like, a bear in the woods, you fight or flight, kind of what's your natural response. But I think that's pretty common when it comes to conflict. I think there are some who want to fight, who want to get throw down and not work through it, but fight through it. And then I think there are probably a larger percentage of people who would just run, who will just, sweep it under the rug. I don't want to deal with this, and I just want to cave up. My sense is that that's just because it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable. And like you said, Karina, you don't want to misspeak. You don't want to be misinterpreted. It's risky. Dealing with conflict feels risky, but I just want to propose that not dealing with it, that either fighting or flighting, not a word, but that both of those are very risky options as well.
Yeah. And me personally, I'm right there with Karina. I'm a 9 Enneagram who absolutely hates conflict, and I will avoid conflict at all costs. But I do believe like that whole fight or flight thing, I think there are, usually there's two types of people. And I feel like nobody's really going to say, oh, I love conflict. I love conflict. They might love that fighting part of it, and they might just love to, oh yeah, I love to get into it with people or like that, but nobody really loves to be like at odds with somebody and disagreeing with somebody and fighting over that, losing relationships over that, losing friendships over that, whatever it is. So there's like those people that are just like, I kind of like that antagonizing, like fighting, making that conflict. And there's those other people like me who I don't like conflict at all.
Right.
But yeah, I think there are different levels of conflict when I think of like in my past, especially growing up in the church, growing up as a Christian, and like conflict I've had with, Christian friends, or gosh, like even my spouse and everything like that. It's like, there's small little things that could result in conflict, and there's bigger things. What I have learned is that no matter what level it really is, there's two different ways. There's two different roads you can go on with dealing with conflict. And, that could lead for like small little things could turn into big deals and relationship breakers if we're not careful. And I'm saying that like, as someone who absolutely hates conflict, I have learned that it's like, man, even in my past, it's like there have been times where I just don't deal with it, and I will be like, I'm just not going to talk about it. I'm just going to run away from it. It'll just work itself out. That whole like, oh yeah, if I just don't talk to my friend about that, everybody will forget about it.
Right.
It never ends up. It never ends up being the same. Like something's always different. It never ends up solving itself, no matter what level of conflict it is.
Yeah. So why don't we do this? Why don't we just start working through like, okay, I find myself in conflict with somebody. We'll just keep it as general as that. What are some things that we need to do to begin to pursue some sort of resolution to that conflict? What are maybe some steps to take for that conflict resolution?
Can I go first? I'm not
sure.
I'm going to go first.
Oh, wow.
Conflict. I think so for me, and this just goes with how I deal with like a lot of stuff, whether it's conflict or stress or anything like that, is I just clam up and I want to deal with everything internally, which I know is bad. But I do think one of the first things I think of when conflict arises is that I think I need to take some time to gather my thoughts. Like that, I've kind of grown up to that. Some people have told me like, oh, if you hold everything in, like that's bad. And I'm like, I get that. But like when conflict first arises, that's something that I need to like, whether it's like be by myself with my thoughts, I need to like gather myself, because like I know that if anything is like, if I'm quick to speak and instead of just like thinking about what I'm going to say, thinking about the situation, that it usually ends up worse. So I first need time to be like, okay, let me figure out what I'm going to say or what I'm going to do next, instead of jumping right into something that could be that I could say something like totally wrong, or that could be detrimental to any of this conflict resolution. So that's my first thing, is I need some space.
Yeah, I think it's good to take some time.
Yeah.
Not only to get your thoughts in order, but to pray. Right? I mean, as Christians, that probably should be our first stop. And really, yeah, you're right. Thinking about it, praying about it, kind of getting your thoughts in order. Karina, let me ask you this question. And I think there's two ways we could go on this, but should you, in that step, in that stage, before you've had any sort of interaction with the person you're in conflict with, to try and find some step of resolution, should you talk with anybody else about it? Or should you not?
I don't have the right answer to this question. That's a really good question. I don't think it's in my nature to go talk to someone else, because I don't want to just start. I think it would, for me personally, it would really quickly turn into like bad mouthing or just bashing. So for me, one of the most crucial things I've had to learn to do is to recognize and claim my stake in the conflict.
Yeah.
I have to be honest with myself and realize I don't want to be quick to just point at the other person and saying, this is what they did, this is how they wronged me. I want to step back and be like, evaluate where the conflict started, how it started, like what it came to, and to own up to my part in the conflict and be honest with myself about that. And that comes through prayer and like internal processing. I think some people are external processors, and for them it might feel more necessary, but I don't know. I don't think I have the ability to do that without spiraling downward into bad mouthing.
Yeah, that's what we got to be careful of, is gossip, right? Like I wouldn't want to say that 100% of the time you should always just do it by yourself. But you better be really, really wary about who you're processing with. Are you processing with a counselor, right? Somebody who is, paid to be a sounding board. That's different than processing even with a spouse or with a close friend, or even like a pastor or a confidant, especially if they have an attachment to that person. You got to be real careful there, because, I mean, biblically, at least, when you got an issue with somebody, Matthew chapter 18 says the first step is to go and talk to them before you bring somebody else in. But I really appreciate, Karina, that you bring up the idea of like owning your part. So, and I think that's an essential piece in a conflict, pursuing conflict resolution, is even if it's the smallest piese, owning your piece, right? Like, how many percentages of this is your fault? Whatever it, is it 2%? Is it 5%? Is it 10%? Is it 20%? Is it 50%? Like, how much do you need to own? And then owning that. And that's, based in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus says, hey, before you start poking at somebody else's log sticking out of their, or that speck sticking out of their face, you got to deal with the log that's in your own. You have to deal with your own issue and sin first. So I think that's huge.
Yeah, I think that's important to also distinguish between like really analyzing it and owning it. Like, conflict is like a relationship. It's a two-way thing, but be careful if you are the type of person that is like, oh, I continuously have conflict. So it's always my fault. Like, I've done everything, like owning it, and then owning, like you said, the percentage thing. Careful if you're the one that's just like, oh, well, it's 100% my fault. It's all me. I'm the one who's messing up. I'm the one doing that, because most likely it's somewhere in the middle or something like that. So I have that in my notes of just like, that's such a huge thing to be like, to humble yourself and be like, here's the deal. I messed up. I know where I messed up, if you know. And then going from there and going directly to that person. You brought up the spouse thing. Like me and my wife, every now and then when we do have conflict with someone, like we'll talk to each other about it, but we are very careful to be like, to tell each of us of like, hey, like you should probably go talk to that person. Or like I'm fine with if my wife wants to like bounce some ideas off me or be like, you know what, like how should I say this to that person, something like that. But we are very careful to be like, hey, this is not going to turn into gossip. Like go to the person if you have a problem with them.
Yeah. I heard somebody say, let's just say you're 10% of the problem. I heard somebody say, own 100% of your 10%.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need to own more than that. And there's some pressure, like Kyle, like you said, there have been times where I've been in conflict and people have wanted me to own more than I can. And sometimes it's like, oh, I need to actually go back and reflect. Maybe I do need to, I thought it was 10%. Maybe I own 12% of this, but own 100% of all of your part.
Mm-hmm.
So in our situation, you have conflict with somebody. You have taken some time to pray, to think, maybe to seek some wise counsel. Being very wise about that, not gossiping, and certainly not just spreading, like you said, Karina, really just kind of getting disparaging on a person.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to just find somebody who's going to lawyer up with you.
Mm-hmm.
That's tempting, but it's not going to be helpful in conflict resolution. But once you've done that step, then what do you need to do?
I mean, my thoughts go to James 1, where it says, be quick to listen, slow to speak. My thing is after you've gotten to that point of you're ready to face whoever it is or whatever, I think it's always best for me to listen first instead of going straight to you did this or whatever. Listen first, being quick to listen, and then being quick to forgive. We've talked about forgiveness on this podcast before. I know it's a hard thing, but it's like, that's what we are called to do as Christians, is to have that like in our mind that we're going into conflict being like, I'm going to forgive. Like that's the ultimate goal in reconciliation and in conflict. But my first thing is just listening and not being like, I'm not going to control this whole thing with just saying everything that I think is wrong, all this stuff. I want to hear the other side first.
So let's even take one step back. You're already sitting face to face with this person in that scenario.
Yeah.
But I'm talking like maybe they don't even know. Maybe they know that you're in conflict. Maybe they don't even know what you're in conflict. Do you text them? Send them a DM?
Yeah.
I'm serious.
Avoid
like how many this is an important step that we shouldn't glance over.
Yeah.
How do you even broach the subject with someone?
I think you need to have a face-to-face conversation. And
say that one more time, just so that everybody who is wants
FaceTime,
who wants to text.
Yeah.
How much safer is it? Does it feel to say, hey, I feel like we need to, deal with this situation instead of meeting face to face, because you got time to think, you got time to edit, you got time to, so say that again, Karina.
You've got to sit down face to face. You've got to be in a space where you can have a conversation.
Yeah.
In the moment.
Yeah.
I don't care how many emojis there are in your phone. You cannot express actual emotion and what you're trying to get across in a text message.
Okay.
And don't try to do the whole recording thing on text message, your voice or whatever like that. You got to be with face to face.
Now for some people, that means like some of our church members who are listening, that means you might need to plan a trip.
Mm-hmm.
You might need to plan a trip home. You might need to get a plane ticket.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because a phone call won't do it. Depending on the level of the conflict.
Right.
A text message, a DM, a comment, I'm just saying this requires interpersonal dynamics that cannot happen even on a FaceTime video chat.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's a big deal. Okay. Now you're sitting in a room with a person. And Kyle, you just said, I'm just listening. Like, so what happens first? Like, what's the first step when you're sitting down with that person? Let's just assume that they know, hey, we're not just having coffee. Okay. Whatever the tension is between us, we can sense it. What's that first step in that conversation that you've asked for?
Well, and I think first step is to, like Karina already talked about, owning your side of it, but just owning the situation of like, here's the deal. We like, no matter whatever level of conflict, especially if it's a big conflict and maybe it's something that has separated you and a friend for a while and you've just not discussed it. Y'all know why you're sitting there and chatting. You know why there's an awkward tension. Somebody needs to just kind of own it in the sense of like, hey, like there's things going on and I want to talk about it because I value our relationship. I value this being resolved. I think sometimes we get to the point where sometimes when I think of conflict, I think of how much do you value that person in that relationship in order to fix this conflict. There's a lot of people who would, if it's a big deal conflict, who would just rather let it go and fizzle out, and that might end up meaning you never speak to that person again, and you might be okay with that. Then that means you didn't really value that relationship as much as you thought. So I think the first thing is to just say, hey, you know what? Let's own it. I want to talk about it because I value care. The other person might not care as much, but at least you'll maybe hopefully get to that point after you've at least owned why you're there and saying, let's talk about this because I care enough to talk about it and to figure this out one way or the other.
So you start with owning it, owning your part of whatever's going on. What else? What do you say after that?
I always feel like I've got to lead with prayer because I want to make sure that I'm not just going to get carried away with myself. I really want to lean into the Holy Spirit and not, I mean, like I said, you want to get defensive. You want to stop claiming your peace. You want to make all the excuses, whatever in the moment. So I feel like for me, because I want to run the other way, I just really like to start the conversation with prayer and just being, honest in prayer to start off.
Yeah. Yeah. Here's what I'll add to this. I agree with both of you guys. I think one of the steps that's often missed in dealing with conflict is communicating clearly the offense. We had some beef or whatever it was, and I'm going to own my percent. I'm going to own that in the conversation, but then clearly saying, hey, this is where I feel like you've wronged me. This is where I feel like something went sideways. Let me be just clear. Sometimes it's, I've been in conflict where it's like, well, you should know what you did. And it's like, well, no, because if I did, then I could actually talk about it and own it. But very few people truly can read the mind of somebody else intuitively enough to really know, hey, how have I offended you? How have I sinned against you? How have I, why is this conflict real? What have I done? Yeah. And I found in doing conflict resolution with people that often the offender doesn't understand the extent to which the offended feels offended. Yeah. So I think this is a really important coaching piece for people who are in conflict to say, hey, when you said that, it hurt my feelings. When you did that, I saw that and I interpreted it like this. And then I think at that moment, that's when you start doing what you said, Kyle, earlier. You start listening, right? You are then slow to speak. Yeah. I think you've got to speak first because you're the one who maybe called the meeting. But then I think from there, then you start to listen and try to figure out, okay, maybe I owned my 10%, but actually it was 15. It was 20. Oh, they brought up this piece. They were defensive. They just didn't respond well at all, But I think you've got to at least bring that to the conversation. Hey, that really, affected me. when you did that.
Yeah, I would say like don't assume that you know how that person is feeling, like how that person is dealing with the conflict. I mean, I think we're selfish, prideful people that I think sometimes if we are the person who have maybe done the wrong, we just kind of assume sometimes that, oh, that person, like they're fine. They're okay. Like it's not that big of a deal. And everyone is different and everyone deals with conflict differently. And something that's minor to me might not be minor to you and might have really crushed you. But then if I go into assuming like that's not a big deal and being careful with your words, like that's not a big deal. Why are you upset about that? Like I didn't think that was a big deal. It's like that I feel like is one of the reasons why people don't go to each other in conflict and just try to let it fizzle out, is because they're like, and that person, maybe they're not dealing with it like I am, or they don't think it's a big deal, or maybe it's not a big deal or whatever. And they don't communicate that. And it's like, that's a huge piece.
Yeah. See, and I think if you pursue conflict like that, I think 7 out of 10 times it will be a positive experience in those conversations. I think 7 out of 10 times the person's like, man, I'm sorry. I didn't mean that to, or you're right. You know what? Yeah, that was careless. That was unkind. I'm sorry. Right. And it can lead to some mending offenses. Here's the question. What about those other 3 times?
That's what I was going to ask you.
What about those other 3 times? So Karina, you're sitting down, you've owned your part. You've, covered it in prayer. You've clearly communicated to the person, hey, this is what's broken right now. This is what hurt me. This is how feel like I've been offended. And they just are like, they pull what Kyle just said. Why are you so sensitive? Like that's like, that is not what I meant at all. That's on that's on you. I didn't mean it like that. I wasn't, you shouldn't be offended by that, and it doesn't go well. What do you do?
Yeah, you're working towards resolution. And so, first of all, if you sat down with them and they knew maybe you were talking about conflict, maybe they didn't, it might catch them a little off guard. So I think realizing when is a place to like, we need to table this conversation. And sometimes that space is just what they need to like process their thoughts, have time for them to think through the situation more clearly. But I think that you do need to follow up with them and have a second conversation and engage in that conversation. I don't know if they're willing, you can't force them to come back into that conversation, but I would definitely suggest planning a time like, hey, I really want to find resolution. So I want to find another time to sit down and talk.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think resolution looks different to everybody. I think sometimes these things do not resolve.
Right.
And it kind of, this reminds me of, many episodes ago when we talked about forgiveness. And I was like, what happens if someone doesn't forgive you? It's like, well, that's a different conversation. It's like, we're not like, that's the whole, like, okay, you have said your piece. You have prayed about it. You have asked God for strength through this, to be honest with this, for some humility, all that kind of stuff. And you've owned your piece 100%. Then it's like, if they aren't accepting of it, if it just doesn't go, like if things don't work out crystal clear and you're like, oh, now we're back to normal, it's all resolved. I just feel like that's something that's like, okay, maybe, you give some time, and maybe that person is like, they'll come around to be like, you know what? I was kind of a jerk. Like I get that, but sometimes that doesn't happen. And that's just when you say like, you know what, you've got to get to a point where you are okay with how you handled it. And you feel like, hey, I really do feel like I prayed through this, and God had me say what I felt like was right. And if they don't accept that, then there's not much else you can do.
Yeah.
But at least feel good that like, hey, I've hopefully you can kind of clear your conscience with that and be like, I at least brought that to them, and I did my piece. And God's going to do the work in that relationship. And if it's salvageable, it is. If it's not, then it's not. And that's a bummer. but it's conflict. Like that can
Well,
happen.
and let's be real. This isn't a surefire thing.
Yeah.
Right. But here's my sense. My sense is that if we pursued this as, let's just say as Christians, as maturing Christians, if we pursued healthy conflict resolution instead of conflict avoidance, 70% of our relationships could be saved. That's again, like, where did that figure come from, Chris? I'm making it up. Okay. It's just purely anecdotal. Okay. But I think, one, that would be a big deal. Two, I think this would also be a real important model for other Christians, for younger Christians, for newer Christians, but also then for our children and for youth and for those in the next generation who see their adult mentors and counterparts avoiding conflict. Very often, just, washing my hands, I'm running, I'm going to go do it's just much easier to find new friends, find a new church, move to a new house, find a new job, and start fresh again. And I'm just saying, I don't think that's what mature adults, let alone mature Christian adults, ought to do. And this is one of the reasons why I think Jesus says, hey, don't let the sun go down on your anger. I don't think he means that completely literally, like you've got 12 hours, figure it out, right? Like I don't think that's exactly what he means, but I think what he's talking about is, don't let this stuff simmer. Like, don't let there should be an urgency, not a recklessness, but an urgency to try to make right things that are in unresolved conflict. And even if it's not all your fault, owning your part, going and clearly communicating what it is, and then trying to pursue that. Sometimes that means, I think there's another step we could have gone into, which is you could bring in a third party. You can bring in like a third party that's unbiased, that's safe for both parties, and deal with some mediation. I've been a part of those that have been really helpful. But I think this is a Christian principle that we should practice more. I think we should, like Kyle said, value our relationships enough to fight for them. And that's going to include embracing some of the hard and awkward conversations. But I think there's fruit on the other side that Jesus would say, that's how I want my followers to be known. Their love for one another is how they're going to be known. So those are my thoughts. Those are my thoughts on conflict. Anything else you guys want to throw in there before we shut this first one down?
I don't have anything else.
Nope,
Karina?
I don't have anything else.
We'll be holding a conflict resolution seminar with these two because they apparently have a big issue with French people. So file your complaints. File your complaints
Full
with the
circle
elders.
right there. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Hey, and church, if you need help with any of this, please feel free to reach out to us. We are here for you. But thank you for listening. Hope this is helpful for you. Thank you guys for chatting about this, and we'll see you next time.